Welcome to Shockaholic, where we discuss the shocking sides of cinema. I'm Chandler Bullock, and today I'm going to go over a video that was voted on by all of you. I put a poll on Twitter, and I asked which of the movies you guys wanted to see, and I did feature a mention of the panels and the lectures that are on the Salem Horror Fest, and that won, actually. It was very close, and I will feature all of the films that I mentioned in the poll. So rest assured, if you were looking forward to one of those films and you saw that the panels and the lectures won, that does not mean I'm not going to talk about them. It's just my time is limited, meaning I have to pick and choose what I do when I do it. So today, this actually works out quite well for me. We're going to go over the panels and lectures that I managed to watch during my time covering the Salem Horror Fest. It's still going on this weekend, but I only had coverage for the first weekend. Fortunately, it was all access, so I had the ability to watch as much as I possibly could, but that does mean that there are a couple of blind spots. I also noticed that there were a couple of things that maybe were given to them late or maybe had been put into a geo-locking system. So there are some of these that I unfortunately would not be able to talk about just because I didn't have access to them, it seems, or maybe they just weren't online yet, but they are currently. So this is the updated program as it is on the website right now. At least at the time of the making of this video, of course. And so we're going to scroll through it, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this. Now, I want to do a quick preface that I did not take notes for these panels. I will very likely purchase an encore for this, or may even get the full access pass here in the near future, because these panels and lectures, as far as I understand it, will be available throughout most of the year going forward. So unlike the films, they are not, strictly speaking, accessible just for the 2 weekends. That's pretty impressive. And there are going to be more events and lectures going on throughout the year, but the majority of your ticket is going to this specific festival this year. Still, I want to be able to get access for these things for my own research, as I'm doing research master still in media, art, and literary studies, focus on horror films, and when I'm done with that, I still want to have all of the stuff to help me with my own research. And anybody who is doing the academic side of horror, these are very useful sources for you. Anybody who's not interested in the academic side, these are still very entertaining and interesting topics, and I love the fact that you are receiving a bit of academic thought in a non-academic way. In some cases, yes, some cases no, but still it's presented to you in a way that's understandable. So we're going to go through them, but just keep that preface in mind. I did not take notes. I was very interested in watching these things more like a podcast. I just wanted to sit back, relax, enjoy the personalities on display, and listen to what they have to say. So if I am a little vague on some of these, and I will be, I'll tell you right now, I'm going to be pretty vague here, but I'll give you my thoughts at the very least. So see it as more of a review than it is about the overview and content of these specific panels or lectures. All right, let's get to it, shall we? We're going to start off with the panels. So we're going to scroll on down, and we'll take a look at these, and I'll talk about them individually, the ones that I managed to see. So here we are. The first one is the Black Diaspora in Horror. I did manage to check this one out. This one's featuring Maurice Brodos, Chesia Burke, Sade Sellers, Leslie Rivera, and Eunice Levi, or Levis? I think Levi. This was a very interesting take on this. You're going to see in these panels that this is a topic that comes up more often. Either, in this case, it's specifically about the diaspora of Black heritage strewn throughout horror from people from different, different backgrounds connected to African cultures, and how they are both depicted, represented on screen. So this one being specifically about it has it as its main focus, but any of the other ones that talk about race in horror have a tendency to fall back on it, as that is the most prominent topic on that discourse that you can discuss. And what made this one more unique, I should say, was that the people that were on the panel are all predominantly horror writers. Now, either they are script writers or they are novelists or nonfiction writers. So all of them come from this background of writing characters, or at the very least writing about characters from the perspective of horror in Black culture. And their focus here was just very broad, I should say, celebrating a lot of the different black characters that we've seen in horror, the ways they've been depicted. And it says here, it features 5 diverse black voices in genre speaking, and that is very accurate. Everybody has a different perspective. For instance, Leslie also comes from a more Latino background as well. And so he brought in a different perspective in regards to blackness in horror, because it was from the perspective of a Latino black man and those experiences. So a lot of experiential talk here, as well as historical talk about horror and representation of black culture and black people. Very interesting. Very interesting. This one's a bit more on the fringe of the academic side, I'd say. It's not pure academic, because I don't think anybody here was purely a scholar, but it is more the voice of people who are creating this media. Whereas on the other side here, we have jet horror, black horror representation from 2010s to now. Very interesting topic, very unique topic as well, because they've decided to focus on the now. The major difference between these two, between the black diaspora and horror and jet horror, is their focuses in terms of time. Most of the time when we're going to be talking about representation for any group, doesn't matter if they're marginalized or not, very often we're going to be looking really far back to see where it came from, and then maybe see how it's changing today. Jet horror is from millennials looking back at the last decade. So it's trying to maintain a focus from the now, because these are the voices who are making the world now. This panel blew me away. This one, not just because of who's on it, but the topic itself, but all of it. Everything, their focus was fantastic. The names here. So we have Prince Jackson, that's from the Nightlife podcast. We have Zero Gravity, Zena Dixon, otherwise known as the Real Queen of Horror, and Anya Stanley. All 4 of them, absolutely phenomenal in how they interacted with each other, in how they came from different perspectives within the same topic. So you got to see a broader scope of the black experience in America and in terms of representation in horror. Their connection was quite strong. Their love of horror was palatable. I've said it on Twitter, I'll say it again. The emotions that I felt with this one they're very strong. I have troubles forming words for it, because I don't want to actually undo the justice that I'm trying to give here, because I think sometimes words can limit emotion. We have a lot of words to describe a lot of things, but I cannot really stress how emotional this particular panel made me. There was a lot of joy, there was a lot of sadness, there was a lot of anger. Hearing the different stories that they told from their personal lives about how they have been treated, about how they have been kept away from particular areas of media, but also just seeing the connection that they have made all from different perspectives, because you do have discussions on mixed race, as well as discussions on male issues within, being black men versus being black women, the differences between those two, and beyond. It just goes further and further and further, and it culminates into this deep connection and love of horror that, as somebody who's not black, I still felt a connection with them, and I loved that openness was there, and I just felt that this is the horror lovers panel for sure. It's just gonna do you so many favors in terms of your emotional development, I'd say. Check it out. All 4 participants of this one really brought their emotional A game, let's say it that way. There's nothing flashy about it in terms of people trying to impress. It's just very understandable, relatable people talking and discussing things in a way that you can engage with and relate to. Like I said, words are failing me. It's the problem with some of these stream of consciousness videos. But like I said, I didn't take any notes in these things, so I'm trying my best to really give you a feel for how I engaged with these. So the very first one, I definitely engaged with this, but it kind of struck me more on the intellectual level, seeing things from a historical perspective, seeing things from how the writing process is. And then the jet horror one really spoke to me as a viewer, as a fan, but also just as a person, as to why I gravitate towards horror, hearing about how other people who have completely different issues and who have struggled in a completely different way found a very similar thing from the genre. So very, very impressive. We're going to move on. The Mothers of Horror one, unfortunately, as much as I really, really wanted to check that one out, was not available. And I don't think it is currently either. I don't know what's up with that one. But yeah, I was really excited to hear about this perspective and to see what they had to bring into it, since it's going to talk about motherhood in horror. So from the perspective of moms, about famous moms in horror, I'm hoping that this is still released at some point, but at the time of this recording, I have not seen it on either the internal list to watch. I only see it on the program here, so I'm not too sure where it went. That's a bit of a shame. I did manage to check out the Roundtable on Black women's horror aesthetics and traditions. This one had Leah Anderson, Ashley Blackwell, Moon Ferguson, Dianca London Potts, and Danny Bethia. Great one. This one's phenomenal. I really put this one up in a very mixed space because you see, just like the two above it, it has both the perspective of horror writers, but also the perspective of horror fans talking about horror, all of them coming from their own perspectives, of course. And all of them are black women. That links every bit of information that they're presenting together. But a lot of them are academics. And that was the most interesting part for me, is that it's kind of a merging between the two. You get a lot of academic discourse on horror, but you also get a lot of personalized experiences and observations. So we're having very intelligent and very well thought out argumentation being presented to an audience in a way that is digestible and conversational. And I think that's exactly what makes this one so unique, is the fact that we get academia in a more conversational way amongst 5 people. So if you are more interested in hearing this historical account of representations of black women in horror, but also about black women's experiences digesting and engaging horror, this is the one for you. You're going to get that kind of intellectual fancy tickled while also hearing a more lived-in perspective. So it was an interesting liminal space that was created here, which liminal spaces in general were quite a prominent feature when we were discussing black horror. So great job here trying to piece it all together into one panel. Moving on, Scored to Death, the virtual roundtable with some of horror's greatest composers. It definitely lives up to the title. It's presented by J. Blake Fischera, with Richard Band, Joseph Bishara, Holly Amber Church, Charlie Clouser, and the legend Harry Manfredini. Ha! It's got some juggernauts of the scene, especially in terms of horror music creation, all talking about their different approaches to scoring a film, what they get as inspiration, and kind of chit-chatting a little bit about making films. This one was an interesting one to watch. I do feel that the people on the panel were a little shy, I think because they all came from different backgrounds or from different eras. Maybe some of them looked at each other like, oh, you're the young new person, or you look back and you're just starstruck by trying to talk to Harry Manfredini. They did converse a bit, but it was a little slow going in some of the conversational bits. Jay Blake did a very good job trying to get them to talk to each other, but I do think in some instances either they were too scared to talk, or they just didn't really know what to say to each other in some bits. But when they did connect with each other, it's exactly what you would want. It's them talking war stories in terms of who they've been working with and the struggles they've had trying to put together some of the scores. They talk about all kinds of aspects of scoring a film. Some questions asked that they tried to answer involved whether they read the script for a film while watching it, trying to figure out the emotional intent of the writer while doing the score, or perhaps if they went into a different mind space. Joseph Bashar, for instance, talked about his rather meditative mindset that he would go into when producing music for a film. And it really created an interesting contrast between them all, because you see how many film composers can inspire each other but have completely different ways of doing it. So even though somebody's sound can really make you feel a particular way, their approach to it may be completely different than yours. And I think that's true just about everything, really. We have our heroes. They always say never meet your heroes. And the reason for this is you have your heroes, but maybe they don't do things the way that you do them. Maybe you completely misread them, and maybe they are different people. Sometimes it's amazing. Sometimes it's a bit of a slap in the face. In this case, I think everybody was having a good time and really enjoyed talking to each other, especially since they all come from different eras and have different experiences, some newer, some older, but all of them really well established. So it's not as if you have anybody who's just scored maybe like one film and goes, okay, I'm taking notes. It was never that. So that was really cool. If you're interested in film music, I'd highly advise you check it out. Unmarked Graves, Women and POC in Horror History was another great one. This one's just a duo who were talking. You have Sapphire Sandalo and Sabina Graves, and they had a wonderful back and forth chit chat. And the biggest difference they had with this one, compared to all the other ones that we're talking about, specifically black culture and black women, this one's about people of color. So the differentiation between the two terms is used quite well in the programming here, because they are both coming from different cultures that are non-white. So one of them is more Hispanic or Latina, and the other is Asian. So that doesn't mean that they solely stayed within the ranges of those two backgrounds, but they do give it more focus. They do talk about black culture as well, but they just want to talk about the experience of being somebody who is non-white in general, or at least coded as non-white to the general public. Therefore, they do talk about some interesting figures. You can already see from the image, they're talking about Millicent Patrick in it. She is their kind of culmination at the end of the discussion. They also talk about Raul Julia. If you've seen it around on Twitter, all these people who are suddenly discovering that Raul Julia was in a production of Dracula, as Dracula. This is where that information came from. This is where these images came from and started circulating. It's done a lot of good for us to realize that, yes, Dracula is Latino. So keep that in mind, everybody. Also, if I recall, they talked about how the design of that play had all of its work drawn and made by Edward Gorey, which is crazy that he was still around while they were doing that production. Because this is when Raul was still really, really young. They also talked about how people can seem invisible when compared to their white counterparts. A very good example was when you have a stage production with Raul Julia and Meryl Streep. And in the photo, you can already see Meryl Streep is front and center. He's standing in the background. It's a great visual representation of how it can feel in the media world as somebody who is of color, that they can do great work and be greatly revered, and still their white counterparts are going to be on everybody's tongues and lips far more often, because they are the ones who are going to be pushed far more often. And Millicent Patrick, of course, embodies this in the strongest way. They do talk about Mallory Ramirez's book a little bit, not in too much detail, because you should read that book if you want to get her insights onto the situation, but they go into Patrick's background as an animator for Disney, and how she very humbly did not claim to have worked on the Creature for the Black Lagoon's design. She just helped, according to her, and how it was clear from her passion that she did everything. Great job there, the two of them talking about it back and forth. And this one's more in the line of the jet horror one, in my opinion. Just two people having a good chat and discussion about something that they are passionate about. I don't necessarily know their backgrounds per se, so there could be a slight academic background here that I'm not familiar with. If so, that's great. I always love to see academia done in a digestible way. Finally, we had The Wicked Women, the new anthology from New England horror writers. Unfortunately, I was not able to check this one out. I did not have enough time. There's only so much time that one can put into a weekend. But I would still say that I'm interested I love the fact that this is representation from people who are writers. I'm more involved in the film scene, so when it comes to novelists and other types of writing, I'm not as versed into that, so it was a little lower on my priority list, but I did engage with as much of female empowerment and witchcraft as I could while I was participating in the festival. So this one I could still suggest to people, especially if you're interested in this more traditional Salem engagement on folklore and witchcraft in New England. So here we have Lola J. Clemente, Jillian Daniels, Lynn Hansen, Christine Lajewski, Trisha J. Woolridge. So that one's there. I just didn't check it out. And we can move on to the lectures. The lectures were from individuals for the most part. I don't recall if any had multiple people. I don't think they did. I think they made a very clear distinction between lecture and panel. The lectures had a more academic approach for the most part, and they were singular research. So, as it implies, they do feel like lectures. You could have had this in a big hall, somebody with their paper or with their notes giving this to you, showing their PowerPoint presentations. That did not deter from the entertainment factor from some of these. Some of these are very, very fun. And I had a blast with the lectures. Again, there are some of these that I did not manage to have the time to check out, but I did check out as many as I could. In that final stretch, I was watching them. Just tons of them. And throughout the time, I was just checking out the ones that really sparked my interest the most at first. So let's go through these now, the individuals. So we're going to start off with Bad Bitches, Sex and Power from the Stake to the Sanitarium. Sorry. That was from Valeska Griffiths. And Valeska talks a bit about pretty much the subject matter of Haksan, actually. And she uses Haksan as a primary source to kind of springboard off of. So she mainly focuses on Haksan and Antichrist by Lars von Trier to talk a bit about how femininity has been portrayed in not only the media, but also in the collective consciousness in terms of witchcraft and female oppression. So like some of the documentaries and other movies that we see here on the Salem Horror Fest, this is a focus on witchcraft and how it was used both as a means to demonize women and take away their agency, but then later how it was used to show women as powerful. And in this case, she really goes hard on the power part, and I quite enjoyed it. And she also talks about how it turned into something different. We may not believe in the old medieval concept of witches anymore. Witches are better understood for their religious connotations these days and for the actual practices that they like to perform. Instead, it turned into hysteria somewhere around the 1920s, and since then it's gone more and more into just neuroses, or, very famously, women are too emotional to be president, as the latest presidential debates have proven. Am I right? That men are totally emotionally capable of being in higher office. And that's kind of where she's coming from with this one. It's a scathing commentary on the situation. You can tell that there's a lot of emotion behind it, and I loved it for that. I really liked that there wasn't much holding back in terms of how Valeska felt. She takes a very strong academic approach to this, but tonally, she does not steer away from telling you how she feels. I mean, the name is Bad Bitches, so she definitely lives up to it throughout the entire presentation. So I really like the juxtaposition of Haksan and Antichrist together. Comparing the two showed a nice time jump between perspectives on this topic, and I don't know if this was done intentionally, but they're both from voices that are Scandinavian. So although Antichrist is an English language film, Lars von Trier is Scandinavian. So having both Haksan and something from von Trier to talk about female empowerment and satanic worship, very strong comparison in my opinion. So yeah, if you're, again, interested in that more witchcraft-sided discussion for the Salem Horror Fest, especially if you want to talk about something that is more focused on the themes that we would generally discuss around Halloween, pick this one up. Check it out. You will not be disappointed. Next one we have But Some of Us Are Fly, the Black Final Girl. This one was not available when I was given access. I don't know if it's geo-locked. If I check the system now, because you see, even though I have access revoked, it just locks all of the different videos. I do see it in the list. So I don't know if it was available the whole time and I couldn't see it, or if it was just maybe on a little late, which is fine. I would have loved to have seen it. I was very excited for this one. They touch upon the concept of the Black Final Girl in jet horror as well. They were really wondering, when are we going to get Black Final Girls? And how is that going to play out? It must play out differently to the way we see it in general. This is going to discuss that far more. This is a lecture by Ashley Blackwell. And as you can see, just from the description, the synopsis here, a lot of careful consideration and thought has been put into it. You can expect a pretty academic take on this topic, and yeah, I would love to find a way to get access to this. I might just pull that trigger just to jump in and see this one. That's how excited I am for this. I really, really, really want to see this one. So that's a recommendation from me just in terms of excitement. All right, next up we have Damsels in Distress No More, Feminism in Giallo. Now, if that doesn't sound a bit like an oxymoron, I don't know. It sounded like a crazy concept to me at first. I could see it, and I was hoping that she was going to go where I wanted her to, and I think she did. So this was done by Stacey K. Shaw, and Stacey is talking about how there's far more female empowerment in Giallo films than you might expect given what meets the eye. Very often we think of Giallo films, we think of beautiful women, scantily clad or fully nude, being brutalized and destroyed in very violent ways by masked men with black gloves. For the rest, we see a director that uses the male gaze in a way to systematically undo femininity. But she points out that the role of women in the films actually tend to play out a little differently than you might expect. Really pay attention to Giallo films the next time you're watching them, because you will see a lot of these women, if not pretty much all of them, are single. They are not tied to men. They are working in freelance positions as skillful, specialized experts in their fields. So they're journalists, they are photographers, they are researchers, scientists, doctors, nurses, dancers. They do what they want. They do not have to do what a man tells them to do. They're doing jobs that, especially at the time, would be more populated by men. On top of that, although you have a male protagonist for the most part who's walking around trying to figure out the situation, it's usually the women who figure things out and help the man by throwing them a softball and like, hey, what about this? And then the man goes, oh, you're right. It's often the women who find the identity of the killers, who tend to be in the position to hold them back, who fight back. You see a lot of struggles. The way women die in Giallo films, though brutal, usually the brutality comes from the fact that women are crafty and they cannot be held down very well. So unlike slashers, where you get those sort of still framed shots of a woman just standing there screaming until the knife hits her, in this case, they're kicking, they're screaming, they're pushing the guy against the wall, they're throwing things at them, they're trying to get out of windows. It plays out far more like Scream than it does Friday the 13th. And that's an interesting dichotomy that she's created here. So this is an academic perspective, but in a more digestible way. Tone, I would say, is a bit academic. I could imagine that being featured at a conference, but the content is very easy to follow. The examples are very strong. She uses a lot of video examples to illustrate her points. So if you like Giallo films, you like the flair, you like the sound of it, you're going to have a fun time watching this particular lecture. Speaking of fun lectures, here we have The Digital Revolution in Found Footage by Mary Beth McAndrews. I don't know if you know Mary Beth, if you've come across her before. If you're on Twitter, you're likely to have stumbled upon her from time to time, if not often. Mary Beth is kind of the expert on found footage. It's the name that pops into my head when I think of found footage studies. Obviously found footage horror films, but found footage in general. She's gonna know what you want to know. If you got a question about found footage, check out Mary Beth, check out her work. She is busy. And she took the time to make this lecture, and it's really strong. It's very academic, but it's not academic in the sense of fancy words and over fluffing of other, scholars out there who came before. Instead, it's a very strong example of how academia could and should be done. It's somebody showing their own work while still giving credit here and there when they need to. But for the most part, she expresses her knowledge on the topic and also expresses her passion for the topic all the while. She's smiling the whole time. She's trying her best to teach you something. And I felt she did a great job with it. The kind of foundation for this one, or the basic spine structure of it, is the fact that if you were to map out the history of found footage, which she does a little bit in this presentation, you can see that found footage seems to rear its head when there are new technologies in film. So with every new technology, we get a new sort of scare. And found footage likes to take advantage of these new technologies. So ranging from how the Blair Witch Project used a lot of older technology, actually, that was quite an interesting case, used some older cameras with some new handheld footage that they could use. That one actually seemed to fall more into the space of the internet. Its marketing really capitalized on the internet and used the viral marketing campaign to make it look real. Then we see all of the personal security systems in houses around the mid-2000s in Paranormal Activity 2, so on and so forth. VHS is a very good example of a movie that tries to utilize as many technological advancements as it can. Although we're watching these films on a VHS, if you pay close attention to the different shorts, some of them use some pretty interesting tech. Even one of them has an implanted eye that has a camera inside of it. So technology is a very strong combination with the horror that you see in found footage. And as the text here implies, I love this particular phrasing, it discusses how to weaponize our dependence on these technologies. So Mary Beth really flexes on this one, not only showing her vast knowledge of some of the most niche found footage horror titles, but also showing you why they're important, why you should be checking them out, and why you should stop shitting on found footage movies. Come on, these movies are good. And I'm not talking about this just because I've been in a found footage horror film before. You should check it out. It's called Vigilance. It's on iTunes. Don't check it out. But I'm talking to you about this because it is a very strong genre of horror film. I feel that found footage can be more effective than a lot of narrative structures, or at least traditional filmmaking. So I'm with Mary Beth on this one, and I'm very happy that she decided to present this to the public specifically for this festival, because I think it was a very good fit, and I appreciated the academic discourse in such a fun and digestible way. So one of the highlights of the festival for me was this presentation, along with the Jet Horror presentation. Check them both out. Okay, up next is Feasts of Fear, Food in Horror Movies by Sarah Stubbs. I did manage to check this one out. It's one of the last ones I checked out. I mentioned before in my coverage of the program that my girlfriend was very excited for it, and we were both very happy to watch it. Sarah Stubbs takes a more informative approach for this particular presentation. So you can tell her passion for food in horror cinema is very strong, because it's a rich discourse that is not talked about, and she's really on to something. She's really on to a whole topic of discussion that could use some more eyes on it, down to, say, the recipes within the series Hannibal, to just how are dinner scenes depicted in horror films. So what she did was take a kind of a bird's eye view on the topic, and she's presenting to the audience a series of different types of lenses that we can look through involving food in horror films. And then she gives you a whole array of examples. I think per topic, she had about 2 video examples and then a list of others that she would just mention to talk to you about. This is kind of like a beginner's guide to it, if you will, an introduction if it was going to be a book. It was very interesting in that case. It could run a little long for some viewers, I think, just because it is the listing thing. So if you've already found really early on the topic of discussion that you were most interested in, that she's going to be talking about, you're going to want her to talk about it at length. And unfortunately, you don't get that with this particular one. You have to see this more as a 101 introduction style presentation. And in that sense, she nailed it. She did a great job with that. My only critique I would have for it was that when she was on screen, you could see her passion, you could see her talking, but the majority of it was the slides. And it was great, but I would have loved if we had this kind of picture-in-picture in there. So that's just a note for people who are also doing presentations of the style. Use your strengths. Not everybody's going to be strongest with the picture-in-picture. Not everybody's going to be strongest without the picture-in-picture. If you're stronger with voice, just use voice. Like right now, I feel that I'm stronger with voice and my microphone and showing you this than I would be showing myself for this particular video. And yeah, I felt that her strength was seeing her talk about it. And I would have loved that a bit more. But still, the passion came through in what she was discussing. And if ever you wanted to hear something unique, a new take on what we can be talking about in horror, this is one. Feasts of Fear. There has been some discourse on food and horror, but not like this. So I'm happy to see her open up the doorways for other people to talk about this stuff. The next one we have here is Hideous Progenitor, Mary Shelley in adaptations of Frankenstein, and unfortunately I did not manage to check this one out. I really wanted to combine it with A Nightmare Awakes, but Nightmare Awakes seemed to disappear from my screen. It was there at the beginning, and then it kind of disappeared from my access. Again, I don't know if that was a geo-locking thing or not, but it seems to be back. I've seen so many people who have watched it, so it could have also been to do with the premiere that it was going to have, that maybe it just didn't sync up well for me. But I figured if I wasn't seeing the movie, I put Mary Shelley to the side a little bit to focus a bit more on my personal interests, and I really wanted to check out the ones on black horror and about femininity in general. But this one looks like it's really well researched. This is by Jude Wright. I can't say one way or the other what I feel about it, but I can say check it out if you're interested in learning a bit more about not only Mary Shelley, but also how she has been adapted over the years. So that stuff is always pretty interesting. If you can take a historical figure, not only look at how they've been adapted, but see what kind of lenses they've been adapted through, especially a figure like Mary Shelley, who was a teenage girl who wrote the birth of the modern horror story. And we need to celebrate stuff like that a bit more often. So often these adaptations are made by men. And it's important to note that men are not going to depict the woman who created the thing that they're into so much in a very satisfying way all the time. So I'm quite interested to know what was talked about in that particular lecture. These two I also missed out on. This is just due to time. You know, I had to get the films in, a couple of the shorts in as well. We have the homoerotic othering in A Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge, and Stranger Things. I'm still very interested in this topic. This is presented by Nicole Mello. I just didn't get an opportunity to sit down to watch it. Each of these lectures is around an hour long. They can range from around 45 minutes to up to an hour and a half to 2 hours sometimes. The panels in particular are quite long. So, you know, I've been working in between as well. So it's not lack of interest that kept me from watching either of these. It was purely time. If you're more into Asian horror, then we have Hopping Mad, A Brief History of Jiangxi Cinema by Charles Bramesco. This one was quite interesting. I saw like the first few bits of it because I wanted to make sure things were working, and I watched maybe the first 5 or 10 minutes of it. It's about a very specific folk tale in, was this Hong Kong, I believe? Yeah, Chinese vampires and other legends. So this one's about a demonic entity, kind of like a vampire, that hops around and is linked to martial arts films. So kind of like a martial arts zombie of sorts that hops and flips and dives and acts very erratic. Very interesting discussion point there. I wish I would have taken the time and just watched the whole thing through. Didn't miss out on it. But yeah, check these out if you can. These two I did check out. We have Mapping Sexual Violence in American Horror Story from Cecilia Abate. This one surprised me Because when I think of American Horror Story, I think of sexual violence. That is the first thought that comes to mind. So when I saw the topic, I initially thought, yeah. I didn't think that there's going to be a way that you could do this that I wasn't expecting. And it totally took me by surprise. This is one of the more unique and kind of creative takes on these sorts of a presentation. So what Cecilia does is she works in more quantitative forms of research as opposed to qualitative. Now, the difference between those two being that qualitative research has a tendency to err more into the realms of talking about things on their more philosophical or psychological state. So things that we can have long discussions about, questions that might bother us that we are looking for answers for. We're getting into the realms of what is beautiful, what is not, what scares us, quality, if you will, in terms of review. But quantitative is more in the realm of statistics, numbers, factual data. It's more empirical in nature. You can get data and you can map things out with the data. So what she has done, and what she is continuing to do, is take a look at American Horror Story, the series, so not any individual season, but the series as a whole, and she has mapped out the instances of sexual violence within the series. She separated it per season, and then from there she has decided to check out particular criteria and look at the percentages. So she's made her own claims and hypotheses at the start of this to see if she was on the right track, and then using data, she's decided to see if she was correct in her assumptions. I'm not going to say whether she was correct in her assumptions or what her assumptions were, because you should watch it to figure that out. But I will say that although some of the data was pretty expected, despite how expected the results were, I was still quite taken aback with just how unexpected the presentation was. I really enjoyed this one. I thoroughly enjoyed Cecilia's systematic approach to this. I don't know if you were aware, but she also runs and curates a open access journal for horror academics and scholarship called Horror Scholar. It's free to apply and it's free to read. So she does her best to help people get published and pay for that. And you should really support that. If you go on Twitter, it's @HorrorScholar. Check her out. Check out the work that she's presented. The very first volume of that journal was dedicated to American Horror Story. Great editing skills, too, by the way. I love the way that those journals look. She's done something here that I think more people need to keep in mind. And she's also reminded people how, when we're doing research, it's great if you rely on research from yourself, I suppose, and you look up the classics and whoever's written on things. But if you want to do a collaboration, there are people who do things outside of what you do. And if you collaborate together, you will make a stronger case. So she's showing the strength of quantitative research in the types of research that we're used to engaging with in terms of horror. So instead of talking purely about the emotional affect of this, or talking about how this could be used as a coping mechanism or anything like that, this is a great gateway into those discussions and to help create research based on what did we see, what actually happened, what are the statistics of this, how much of one thing did we see, how much of another, what season did what. And you don't have to do that research anymore because she is doing it. And for as long as American Horror Story continues to create seasons, she will add to her data and create a comprehensive, quantitative list of information pertaining to sexual violence within the series. So hats off to you, Cecilia. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. We also have the Masque of the Red Death. As the name implies, it's about the Masque of the Red Death. It is still a lecture. And it's also a reading of the Masque of the Red Death. So that makes this a little different than the rest. This is Brian Christopher who has put this together for us. Really interesting stuff. He really goes into the plague as a problem within Western society. So showing how COVID-19 is not the first time we as a people have had this problem on a wide scale, nor is it one of the worst. Just trying to put that into perspective, but also trying to show you how things haven't necessarily changed very much either in terms of how the people at the top behaved, how people behave in general. So he talks a bit more about how a society responded to various plagues over time in the medieval era, before then, after then. Obviously, he talks about the Black Plague, very famous one there, but he also talks about cholera, tuberculosis, Spanish flu, of course. And he begins the presentation with this historical account, factual account, and ends it with the last 20 minutes or so as him reciting the Masque of the Red Death. So what he's trying to do is recontextualize Poe's work to show you how modern of a sentiment it actually has behind it, and to show you how cyclical society and human nature tends to be. How the responses we have to these things don't necessarily change with technology or with more cultural development. Very interesting presentation there, especially if you're interested in our more current affairs. That's going to be the one for you. Here, moving on, we have Plug It Up! Puberty and Menstruation in Horror Films by Dr. Rebecca McKendry, one I was immensely excited for. And unfortunately, this was one of those that did not show up on my list when I had access. I do believe it is there now. I saw it on the list recently. I do believe it's also showing up for the separated categories as well for the different weekends. So if you have time to check this one out, maybe this one was just a little late coming in, I can imagine. So, it's very exciting. I really, really wish I could have seen this. If you don't know Dr. Rebecca McKendry, she is the host of Nightmare University, which is a Fangoria podcast. She's also one of the hosts of Shockwaves, a horror scholar, a doctor in horror studies, knows just about everything you can imagine when it comes to the history of horror. If you want some deep cuts, Dr. Rebecca McKendry is the person to go to tell you the deepest of cuts. She cuts deep with her information on horror. And this is going to definitely be a great companion to her Nightmare University material. So I imagine this is a presentation in the vein of her podcast. Very educational stuff. Check out Nightmare University if you have even an inkling of academic interest in horror, or you even want to know what horror academia could be like, what these lectures could be like. She's a great example of this because she is a great podcaster as well as a great scholar. So she brings in information that is well researched, but she talks about it in a way that is as easily understandable as possible and still entertaining because of her passion and just because of her personality. She has a great personality to listen to on a podcast. But if you want to see or hear her more unhinged, I suppose, or at least off the cuff, then you should definitely check out her work with Shockwaves and Screen Drafts. Anytime she's been on Screen Drafts, you get to see more of the human behind the scholar. That's very fun. I love that she isn't afraid to wear both hats at the same time at all times. Really show you who she is and how she works. Even if she's like in an atmosphere, she's trying to be professional, she's going to still be herself. Now we have Rendering the Invisible Visible, Black Femininity as Unsympathetic, Powerless, Monstrosity. This one was by Rhonda Jackson Garcia, and I loved this lecture. I really did. It delves into some of the issues that we already discussed from the panels. It talks about the Black diaspora in horror, but it also talks a bit more specifically about Black women and depictions of Black women in horror. And to get even more specific, she's making some claims and some observations in regards to how Black women have a tendency to be put more into this monstrous position. So either they are monstrous in terms of they go against the grain and are stubborn or aggressive, or quite literally transform into monsters. So if you have a Black woman featured in a film and they need to have a monster transformation, oftentimes they're going to be the source of this. Look no further than demons if you want to see the origin of where the demons start to arise in the very first demon that you get. This is handled with a lot of grace, I would say. I loved listening to her speak. I loved listening to the different scholarship that she brought forth. The topic itself just kind of dragged me in. This is one of those I really wish I would have taken notes for, because I'm losing a little bit of the detailed conversation, but all of the emotions that I felt are coming back up when I'm talking about it. I just found it a very empowering and peaceful conversation that was being said here, because the sheer talent of giving a presentation was strong here, and I really appreciate that. But also the topic was so well researched and so easily spoken about that I could have listened to this for hours. I would have loved to have been in a conversation about this. I really enjoyed it. So this particular one, it struck a chord with me because I tend to like to study monstrosity myself. I'm a bit more interested in liminal spaces and more in the cosmic realm of horror, and just the thought process of what we don't understand and why that tends to frighten us. And she really nailed it by combining that sort of an emotion and then that fear with trying to understand Black femininity in horror films, and how writers and directors have a tendency to use Black women as either representations of that fear, or maybe they themselves put them in that position, put Black women in that position because of the sort of monstrous otherness that they feel towards them. Not to say that they are exerting any sort of disdain or racism necessarily, perhaps, but in generally, it's more of a passive subconscious thing. It's more of a systemic thing. So structurally speaking, this seems to take place more often. And she's talking about this quite intricately. Again, you can see from the description that it's very well researched and thorough. So it's a very thorough presentation you have here. And one of the longer ones, but one of the more impactful ones, I felt. So massive recommendation for this one. And lastly, we have Salem on the Barents Sea, the 17th century witchcraft trials in the Finnmark, northern Norway. And this was presented by Dolores Dunn. I started it off, but I had to turn it off. And it had nothing to do with the presentation itself. It had everything to do with I needed to do something. So unfortunately, I didn't get around to actually watching it. I did see at the beginning it is based off of a book that was found by Dolores. And then, they went from there and put together this presentation based on the research that they have done. I do think it's an interesting way to talk about the Salem witch trials, is to link back to this Scandinavian heritage, to also discuss the witch trials taking place in Europe in conjunction with the witch trials that were taking place in the United States. It's an interesting topic of discussion. I would have wanted to see it, but I didn't get the chance. So for those of you, again, interested in witchcraft studies and just about that whole era of oppression and trying to understand it on a wider level, this is one you should check out. So in general, let me recap a little bit what my personal favorites and recommendations were and are between the panels and the lectures. So from the panels, there were a lot of really good ones here, but the ones that jumped at me, the ones I can't get out of my head that I just love, and I really wish I had, if I could find a recording of it somehow, to just go back to it whenever I feel like it. The jet horror, black horror representation from 2010s to now is a must. Possibly my number one. If you watch a single one, just one, that is the one you should watch. It's just so good and affecting. I cannot stress it enough. If you are a horror fan, I don't care what your background is. I don't care if you understand situations from other people's perspectives well or not. Just check it out. For one, if you're not black, I find it even more important that you watch this one, just so you can get a better understanding of the problems that black people have to deal with every day in a way that is even more clearly stated and humanly stated. That's what really got me. These are things that, if you're a bit more educated in cultural practices, you know about, but they still don't quite get you unless you're hearing it from a human voice. And so this is a very human discussion from four people who are just talking about their lives and their love of the genre. So in that way, it hit it home. It doesn't try to state something in an academic way. It doesn't try to like overdo it in philosophizing a situation. It just talks about, this is what I've experienced. You see them relating with each other. You hear how they're talking about things. You will recognize a lot of the things they're talking about, and you will realize how you have contributed to these things. The thing that I learned the most from this one was about microaggressions. I'm not going to say too much about it because I want you to take the time to watch it and let Zero tell you a bit about microaggressions. Zero did a great job on that one. Anya jumps in about microaggressions as well. So this one, go to it. Next up, I would also have to give a good recommendation to a roundtable on Black women's horror aesthetics and traditions. It may feel like it's a big overlap with the Jet horror one, but because it has that extra kind of academic flair to it, and because it's specifically honed in on Black women, I think that it's worth checking out. It is less of an overlap and more of a complementary panel with the Jet horror one, so that's a great double feature. Check them out. And, if you're a horror fan, you should love double features. So that's the best double feature you could get. Scored to Death, yes. The only weakness I found with it, really, was the fact that of all of them, you have a lot of new voices with these. And this one has very known names in film scores. So it felt a little conference-like to me. But I'd still say check it out. For those of you who are more interested in, say, the retrospectives about Joe Dante and all of the celebrations for older movies that they have going on at the Salem Horror Fest, this is the one that combines the best with those. So check that out if you want to also, check more into the reunions and things like that. Unmarked Graves, Women and POC in Horror History, phenomenal one, very good. You're going to learn some stuff about particular people within horror development that you may have been aware of, but still you're going to learn something new. They really bring in some interesting, well-researched stuff. And again, this one's far more casual. So although it's well-researched, it's not as if it's giving you research. So I really enjoyed that. Highly recommend that you check that one out. For the lectures, there are a lot of lectures that I want to recommend to you. Bad Bitches, Sex, and Power from the Stake to the Sanitarium. Yes, check it out. Combines perfectly well with the... what was it? Witches of Hollywood? I think this was the name of that one. That documentary combines perfectly well with that one. In fact, I would suggest that you watch The Witches of Hollywood and then check out Bad Bitches, Sex, and Power from the Stake to the Sanitarium, because like the Witches of Hollywood one does a great job of giving you the historical insights to it, but it's very controlled. It's a documentary. Then you have the Bad Bitches one, which is going to go more into the nitty-gritty minutia and talk a little bit about modern era work as well, and just kind of tell you from the perspective of a woman of what it feels like to see these sorts of depictions and to have dealt with things like this. So that's a great combination there. But Some of Us Are Fly, the Black Final Girl, check it out if you can. You will be in a position that I will be very jealous of you because I really wanted to check it out. So do check that one out. Damsels in Distress, No More, Feminism, and Giallo. I mean, if you like Giallo films, you need to check it out. Very simple. Digital Revolution and Found Footage is a must. I don't care if you like found footage or not. That's exactly why you should watch it. If you haven't really engaged with found footage because you think it's stupid, Mary Beth is going to tell you how much you are wrong and going to hopefully help you to build an appreciation for that subgenre. This is not to say that everything in the subgenre is good, by the way. There are plenty of found footage movies that I think are garbage. Like the found footage movie that I was in, Vigilance. It's on iTunes. You should not check it out. It's not very good. But still, I'm in it, so maybe check it out. In this case, she just shows you how academically valid the whole art form is. And it's a highlight for me. This, of the lectures, is in a kind of joint number one space. So just how Jet Horror is like if you're only want to watch one panel, you should watch that one. If you're only going to watch one lecture, it should be this one or another one, which we're going to get to. But this one is a definite must. Horror fans, just watch it. Feast of Horror, I could recommend if you're kind of interested in the topic. I can see some people really not liking it, especially the list style presentation to it, but it's a good 101 kind of thing. So if you want an introduction to how you could look at food and eating practices in horror. Check it out. Good one. Didn't get to see these. And my other number one is Mapping Sexual Violence in American Horror Story. For the sheer fact that Cecilia decided to take this in a different direction than the normal by showing you quantitative research and doing it in a way that was very interesting. I don't like quantitative research, and now I'm kind of a bit more interested in quantitative research. So, yes, American Horror Story fans, it's a must. Horror fans, I think it's a very, very strong one. And for anybody in horror scholarship, this will help you rethink how you approach your research. So Cecilia did a great job there, and you need to check out her work. I think more eyes need to be seen on her product. And let's see, yeah, Rendering the Invisible Visible, Black Femininity, and Unsympathetic, Powerless, Monstrosity is an absolute must for all scholars. If you are a scholar of any kind, check it out. And if you're not a scholar, I think that you could still get a lot out of this. I feel that Rhonda did a very strong job with making sure that she was understandable. But she does go to some places that if you've done some horror scholarship, especially some work on Monstrosity, it's going to be a little bit more understandable. Don't worry, though. If you don't know that shorthand, if you don't know exactly what she's talking about, she does clarify. She never will leave you out in the dust. And if you do feel like you're just way in the ether and you're lost and you're terrified, good. That is kind of the point. So don't be afraid to check this one out. It's a little more bloated, I suppose, than some of the others in terms of how academic it is. But for that sake, I think that anybody who doesn't come from an academic background will get a lot out of it, because you will see, if you know anybody who's like, oh, I study horror, this is what we're doing. This is it. So for anybody I know personally, check that one out. All right, everybody. These are my recommendations and my individual reviews for the different panels and the lectures. I know this was a very, very long video. I'm sure most of my viewers are not even this far into the video. So if you have gotten this far, thank you immensely for checking it out. It means a lot to me that you would even check out my videos this way. I'm super excited to see that so many people on my Twitter had decided to vote for this topic. It makes me wonder if you might be more interested in some sort of academic work from me as well. I'm still, trying to get that degree, so I've taken a very long sabbatical. It's still kind of a refresh moment for me, but I'm trying to get back into that. So if you'd be interested in me doing some of my own academic research or seeing what I'm doing, let me know in the comments, okay? So just go down to the comments and have a say, or just tell me on Twitter. It's @ShockaholicyT. If you liked it, please give it that thumbs up so that I can see that you've enjoyed what I've been putting out. If you didn't like it, you can put a thumbs down, whichever, but please engage in some way. Make sure that you subscribe for more. I will always announce these things on Twitter, but it really helps me out if you subscribe to the channel, so please do that. And until next time, guys, I want you all to stay safe, keep each other in your thoughts, and make sure to check out Salem Horror Fest 2020. Check out some of these panels. If you got some spare time and you're kind of a little tired from watching movies, this is the best way to detox from some of that stuff, is to combine the two. Watch a movie, then go find a panel or a lecture that has a similar topic in there, and then you can hear somebody kind of help guide you through the different themes that you just saw. You could do it the other way around, but I think the best way to do it is see a film first and then start discussing the different things. So then maybe you can watch it again and you'll get something else out of it. So that would be my advice for you. Again, thank you guys. Lovely people. Love all of you. And until next time, keep shocking.